Welcome to the 37th episode of Speaking of Poetry. I am Rennie McQuilkin, Connecticut's Poet Laureate and also Simsbury's. I am delighted to present bi-monthly readings by some of the area's finest poets, and today I'm very pleased to be joined by Paul Scollan, who will read some poems from his two Antrim House books, Liberty Street Hill and Unaccounted For. If we're lucky, maybe he'll even read some new poems. Paul makes the common uncommon. Like Winesburg, Ohio, the poet's hometown of Meriden, Connecticut, stands for more than itself. Its people and places achieve mythical dimensions, though always in down-to-earth language. Paul Scollan recently retired after more than 35 years as a clinical social worker and administrator at mental health centers. His poetry has its source in his professional work, but also in his experience in the Vietnam War and his life as part of a large Irish family. His first book was a finalist for the Eric Hoffer Award, and his poems have appeared in many journals, including the Connecticut River Review, Sow's Ear, the William and Mary Review, and Oasis Journal. Welcome to Speaking of Poetry, Paul Scollan.
Oh, thank you very much, Rennie, for that introduction. In writing poetry, I attempt to give voice to others with little or no voice. In so doing, I hope to find my own. My first poem is entitled Mr. Engels, and it's from Liberty Street Hill, the first book here. I think that we all have had a Mr. Engels in our lives, like a high school teacher who leaves a lasting impression. And this is the case in this poem. Mr. Engels. Mr. Engels, my high school English teacher, must have sensed that this waffling, wiseacre kid was turning a corner towards something besides girls, clowning, loafing, and girls, when he didn't make a martyred face on hearing the class assignment to read everything we could read by an American author, and mine, he decided, would be William Faulkner. Said, as I recall, without a smidgen of mischief in his kindly face. And so in the weeks to follow, I felt quiet and unglued, caught in the pull of the swamps and the blood-run clay of Mississippi. And come time for the oral presentation, I was surprised at how I threw myself into it, all ass, arms, and elbows, taking the plunge, gasping for air through the Yazoo rivers, sucking mud and undercurrents, doing my damnedest to make sense of the run-on lines, the liberties with time, the knotted kinship of sharecroppers, slave offspring, deluded gentry, misfits, swimming for all I was worth, near drowning, but at last making it to the bank on the other side, collapsing at Mr. Engels' feet, looking up to him, beaming a teacher's beam, grinning the gotcha grin of knowing that the potion took hold, but would take its sweet time delivering the punch someday. Like early one morning over coffee, when bone-tired, staring out the kitchen window at the broomstraw maple tapping against the unopened sky, and the last patches of snow sliding downstream, yesterday closing down so much it was hiding from itself. Then whoomp, it kicks in a way that coffee can't, not even close. Now, this poem is entitled Two Old Dogs. I decided to have my deceased English bulldog write a poem about me. And we are, or have been in many ways, similar. Two old dogs. He's snoozing more, slower to fetch, scratching his head a lot, I've noticed lately. And what's more, he bumps into hallway walls looking for a daydream alcove to snuggle into, and gnaws on a knuckled bone while lost in the static passing through his head these days. Getting more peculiar for sure, this curiosity of his. He'll be standing there just staring at things in the yard, like the monarch on the butterfly bush, wondering aloud how the tiny hairpin of a body can part the wind and clouds with its vast, fire-inspired parchment. And the windfall oak, how its small root ball can hold a country of catacomb dwellers who, stunned by the daylight, crawl warily out of their homes. I'm worried about my master's getting to be too much like me in his idle musing. And that can't happen. It bumps up hard against the order of things. That was a poem from my second book, Unaccounted For. This is also from that book. The poem is entitled Hero Worship, and this is where nostalgic fantasy kind of meets reality. I was attending my 50th high school reunion, and the poem is pretty much self-explanatory. Hero worship. I look out over the room, and there he is, sitting at the corner table at our 50th reunion. Once the 12-year-old whose uncanny curveball nicked the corner of the plate almost every time before smacking my catcher's mitt, the pitch that single-handedly snatched the title for our team. In dreams and idle musings over the years, I replayed the pitch in my head, the wind-up, release, trajectory, red stitches on a side roll in a downward arc to the batter's short-reaching swing. The perfect trueness of it inspired me over time to dig in deep, to hone fine edges, focus hard on every task undertaken thereafter. After the handshaking, backslapping, cracking wise about the ravages of age, I cut straight to worshipful words about the boy wonder on the mound, enough to enshrine him in Cooperstown. Boy wonder hears me out in full, but with puzzlement in his eyes. He comes back with a dismissive sweep of the hand saying, "Thanks, old buddy, but you got it all wrong. It was really the father and son coaching duo that won the day, just in the way they took us in like sons of their own, making all the difference." Next day, my mind falls back to its usual groove, but strange to say, the catcher is leaping, lunging, digging in the dirt to save wild pitches, forgotten in the stirred-up infield dust of Victory Day. Next poem is called Mad Molly's Watch. And in my many years in community mental health, I encountered many people like Molly. She's sort of a composite of many. I had one in particular in mind. And, we talk about delusions and hallucinations, but who are we to doubt all the time that some of these things can't be true? Mad Molly's watch. She'd call them lapses, those moments when the old man nodded. And this wasn't just dozing off. This was God she was talking about. And yes, she knew you'd say he couldn't be God if given to such mortal flaws. But though strange and silly the notion, she'd say he was sleeping on the job. In the beginning, it was nanoseconds. Then, ever so slowly, ever so slightly, efficiency started slipping. Matters left untended The scatter of adversity meant to strengthen character became grand, sweeping, natural disasters. The plan got away from him. Even the Great Flood got out of hand. Too big, too apocalyptic, too Cecil B. DeMillish. While tugging on a smoke with tremulous hand, she'd tell all who would listen how one day the old man came to her in a whisper from lips grazing her ear. One small favor, he asked, just one, that she keep him from dozing. And she'd know it was coming by the itch near the birthmark on her ankle. With all her might, she must train her focus on the tiny hairs residing in his nose, enough to make him sneeze and rouse him. And that's what she did for a time, but the pressure got to be too much. And soon she cracked under the strain, waking up in the psych ward one morning, dribbling pills. No more birthmark itch, no more keeping watch, no more whisperings from the old man, except years later, the last time. The message seemed clear at first, saying her work was done, and he was ever so grateful. She was never entirely sure of the words that followed. She thought she heard him say, "Now we are tumbling toward the night." And at other times, "Now we are fumbling for the light." This is a poem also in Unaccounted For. It's called Fats, and it's a story my mother told many times, and I thought I'd write it, turn it into a poem because I thought it had possibilities. It's called Fats. On piano scales, diligent. On 3 assigned polonaises, diligent. Under the delicate glass dome of Chopin, she found bliss for a time. Then all of that changed on hearing the man on the radio, the wizard of the ivory striding fingers, and the high hallelujah of the vocal pipes. It was Thomas Wright Waller, i.e. Fats Waller. Love at first listen. To piano tutor Miss Adams, this was pure frivolity and distraction. Musically misbehaving, she said, pleased as punch with her play on words. She wouldn't stop pestering Miss Adams to play him, though, and it paid off. Her ruler-wielding mentor caved in at last, but not without conditions. Mind you, only if the next lesson were completed to her satisfaction, and only a few bars. Next week, with hands poised over the keys, hands detached from the inert rest of her, posture ramrod straight on the bench, Anna Lee Adams dipped her fingers, lightly at first, into honeysuckle rose, and before you knew it, she dove into it, body and soul, her young student there beside her, wrapped in its rapture, who, in her 80s, umpteen years later, stuck to her story that Miss Adams' buttocks started bouncing on the bench, shoulders rolling along in rhythm, a half smile creeping over her face, then quickly suppressed. The next story, and many of my stories are true, with a few poetic liberties, if you will. And this is about our parents' generation, my parents' generation, a whole different lot entirely. And the title is Buick Real. Bumped into Mr. Bergeron at the coffee shop early morning. No mistaking that Gallic nose, short wiry body, and jaunty gait. His story told me in my teens percolated up on seeing him. How at age 19, a landing craft disgorged him onto an ashen atoll in the Pacific, where he only moved by crawling on his belly with his buddies. eating ash and dirt, shitting in his pants without knowing it, and spitting curses against every deafening spray of metal. He grinned a wide grin on seeing me, threw out a hand for firm shaking, then waved me out to the parking lot for a look at his brand new Buick Real, sitting there lolling in its imperial shine. Finishing the tour inside and out, he paused while leaning against a fender, dropping word matter-of-factly as rain on rooftops. The doctors gave him but a few months more. Before I could muster a lame response, he gave a wink and a pat on the back, tucked the New York Post under his arm as he snatched up his cup of Takeout Joe from the hood, then slung himself into his slick, black Buick Regal, his fourth to last time driving it. Next poem is A Spit of Sand, and this too is, let's say, an amalgam or an amalgamation of many people I've known over the years in my work in mental health. But this is a woman who, in later life, is somewhat lonely and bitter, but holds on to hope and a feeling that she will be delivered one day. A spit of sand. Beauty, children, choice is gone. The string of men the same, thank God. Back home from nights of waiting tables, she props her feet and reads till dozing. Stirs awake at some wee hour to cast about inside her head, to fetch the scene that's waiting there. A South Pacific spit of sand, 2 palm trees standing by themselves, a hammock strung between the two. She stretched out in the slender pouch, swinging far to touch the salty wet on one side and the other, till waters rise and catch her gently, wash her clean from birth to Tuesday, wash her out to sea, a life ahead of misery. Paving Stone is my next poem, and it is also from Unaccounted For. And I wrote this poem because I realized that with some people in our society, they're not too far, only maybe a misstep away from true hardship and poverty. Paving Stone. Was a paving stone stepped on that twisted her ankle on the walk to the bus stop, slowing her down to a hobble and causing her to miss the bus, leaving no choice but to call in sick, to be told she'd be let go despite a good work record. And with that came the loss of her medical plan, the lifeline for her out-of-work husband and autistic son, thus spiking their debt sky high, and before they knew it, 2 months back rent, and the landlord's final notice putting them out on the street to sleep in the beat-up station wagon and into the hands of social workers and the kindness of strangers. Was the same small stone kicked up over the curb by a dump truck 5 years ago, embedded in the grass strip between the curb and sidewalk, then dislodged onto the walk last week by the neighbor kid on a skateboard, next day almost brushed back onto the grass strip by 2 leashed dogs crossing paths, one of the dogs belonging to the bus driver, who later wouldn't stop to wait for the limping, waving lady he saw in his side view mirror because he was behind schedule. Next poem is called Net Worth, and this is about 2 very dead serious life insurance salesmen who came into my office where I worked. I really wasn't expecting them, and I think one was the mentor and the other was kind of in training. net worth, well, they wanted to know net worth. And so goes the poem. In tailored suits with candy cane neckties on bibs of starched white, two young salesmen strode into the room with chests out, posture ramrod straight, right hands loaded to thrust into mine for a sober round of finance straight talk. Life insurance was what I needed, said one to the other, nodding, to ease the doddering, worried mind. Just a matter of finding the right fit. One to plunder before you're under, or another that ripens gloriously for loved ones, to be awarded posthumously. Before I could beg off for a pamphlet, they shuffled plans and riffled papers for me to sign here, there, then popped the question, quick and bold. By the way, what's your net worth? A short pause, long enough to let pass a marching brass funeral band. Does that include these shoes? I asked, pointing to my battered brogans. Another pause, much longer. The next two poems are about my youngest brother, Raymond, who died in 1987 of AIDS. The first one is called Balance. And this is when we first discovered that he had AIDS and that he was homosexual. It's called Balance. It wasn't hand, eye, reflex, bicycle, or road below that failed him. No, none of those when he fell to the sidewalk on his way home from work in the big city. It was the virus that wormed its way into the brain, where the nexus of balance lay. He later learned. For him, the utter bewilderment, the sudden vertigo, there on the sidewalk, face down, the bicycle thrown along the curb, the wheels still spinning, the great spheres cockeyed on their axes. Hanging on to the curbside sapling, he slowly rose to his feet, shaken to the depths of him. The self-correcting gyro gone haywire, no longer assisting the navigator, bringing an end to all he knew and the start to a long roll of hospital wards, visiting nurses, filled pill boxes, families scrambling, dumbly standing by, some of them walking into 3 rapid-fire punches, gay, AIDS, dying. He leaned on the cane, suddenly into late age, turning from the thoughts that fly to fear, of judgment, retribution, narrow footpaths for the righteous, mother's reproach, Sodom, Sister Mora's stretched wimple, deadly sins coiled like tapeworms, squared certitude, the catechism's crisp answers, all now afoul with man and man together, the unutterable, seraphim turning into gargoyles, all falling down on the priest-ridden forebears, falling down, the impact, the hydrant, the no parking sign, the crack in the curb shooting grass, the jagged teeth on beer bottle glass, down there where the broom sweeps. This is an associated poem. It's called Alias, 1986. Also about my brother, and in those days, in the mid to late 80s, in the hospital, they gave you an alias name because it was considered a shameful thing. AIDS alias, 1986. His designated alias was Tim Olson, brother and patient at that big Boston hospital. And Tim Olson was the name key the lobby's receptionist gave us to be sure we'd locate the right patient. But before that, we had to give the lady his real last name, hoping against hope, the preening of goodness in our faces and the eking out of meekness in our demeanor would reverse their harsh sentence and give our brother a reprieve. My next poem is Haircut, and which proves that I guess you can find art anywhere. It was one of those family discount haircut stores where you get the next of 4 or 5 hairdressers. She was petite, in her early 20s likely, tattoos of something on her right upper arm, short cropped hair dyed orange, a small ring in her left nostril, and introduced as Megan, and I wondered what I had gotten into. Then, without my saying, she told me what I wanted, correctly, and commenced to move deftly through my shock of wild Einstein hair, snipping in neat layers with scissors and comb as snowy tumbleweed rolled down the dark blue cape. And my remark that she seemed a pro set loose a flow of self-revelation, of wanting to get into graphic arts like her dad, but ending up as a hairdresser instead, practicing on her dad till she got it right. And now this was art too, wasn't it? And in no time she was done. Dropping scissors and comb, she picked up her hand mirror and flashed back a perfectly sculpted cut, saying this was part of her and I'd be taking part of her with me. As I unhooked my jacket and reached for the sleeve, I looked back to see her sweeping my hair clippings into a delicate standing pile, and ever so gingerly picking it up with her fingers and placing it down under her big mirror workstation, as if it were a cast-off secondary creation, just as perfect from me to her. Now, a poem about Meriden. It's called Factory Town. So say some people in the know, it's the overgrown kid going wrong that only a mother could love. I see a backstreet lot all crazed with cracked tar, as well a Wordsworth's meadow of thistle and chicory in a drunk's sway of standing purple all the way to the loading dock and back. A brick-faced corridor burning the eye, as well the parting sun's backboard mural of last-minute sketches of beauty unexpected. A row of windows from a soot-smudged eave, as well the image keepers of cupolas and steeples, of haystack clouds tagging one after the other.
Thank you, Paul. That was wonderful. I love the cast of characters. There's a dog in there who's worried about your sanity, and Mad Molly, who's worried that God is napping off, and that wonderful picture of the piano teacher falling in love with Fatswaller's honeysuckle rose, and then those are such powerful poems about your brother's AIDS, such a variety and a cornucopia of both joy and sorrow in those poems. So thank you so much for that wonderful reading. And I'd like also to thank Karen Handville, the enormously talented station manager of SCTV, and Ken Picard, who produces this show. If you would like to learn more about Paul Scollan's poetry and read samples from his book, please visit the Antrim House website, antrimhousebooks.com. You may also be interested in other Antrim House poets whose lives and works are described on the website. Goodbye for now until we meet again next month for the 38th installment of Speaking of Poetry.